Juan Mendez Scott's Hologram. Chapter 11. How can you be so greedy? When I drove up to the Rosario home, I saw Estella's BMW truck parked in the driveway. It was a gorgeous day, so I figured right away she was chilling out in the backyard. As I walked around the Rosario house, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. I found Estella sitting in a patio chair as I predicted, sipping on a drink and looking visibly disturbed. I approached her, and she jumped in fear at my sudden presence. I could see that she had been through a lot, and I couldn't help but feel guilty for not being there for her. Stella? Stella, where have you been? I asked her, but she just shook her head, refusing to talk about what had happened. Stella, answer me. Where have you? I'm not going back there, Estella said, shaking her head. I'm not going back to that house. Stella, come on, now. I'm not, Estella said, raising her voice. Ever. I stared at Estella, disappointed. And my stare did not intimidate her at all, shaking her head. No. I peered back and saw Mrs. Rosario standing on the patio, a drink in her hand, watching us with suspicion. I knew that I had to defuse the situation before it got any worse. Mrs. Rosario's expression softened, but she still gave me a nasty glare. I could see the trauma in Estella's eyes and the way she was holding herself. It was clear that she was suffering. I could smell the alcohol on her breath, a clear sign that she was trying to numb her pain. I could hear the wind blowing a gentle breeze, rustling the leaves in the trees and the sound of the birds chirping in the background. I could see the sun shining brightly on her face, highlighting the tears streaming down her cheeks. I could sense the tension in the air, the weight of the situation on my shoulders. I knew that I needed to handle this delicately, to be there for Estella and support her. I got down on my knees, pleading with her. Stella, I'm here for you. I know you're going through a tough time, but please let me help you. I'll do anything to make this better for you. I reached out my hand to her and she took it, allowing me to pull her into a hug. I held her tightly, whispering soothing words to her, promising her that I would be there for her every step of the way. Stella, please. You can't just give up on us. We can get through this together. I begged her to not give up on us, on our future together. I knew that she was going through a tough time, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing her. I promised her that we would get through this together, that I would be there for her every step of the way. But Estella was firm in her stance, shaking her head and insisting that she would never go back to that house. I could see the fear and pain etched in her face, and I knew that I had to respect her wishes. Stella, come on, now, I said, begging, trying to coax her into coming back to Roxie's house with me. But Estella just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'm not going back there, she said. I'm not going back to that house as long as her hologram is there. I tried to explain to her that what she thought she saw might not have been real, that it was just in her head. But Estella was adamant, insisting that she knew what she saw. Stella, please, I pleaded, I can't do this without you. But Estella just tried to walk away from me, and I had to hurry to catch up with her. I grabbed her by the arms and promised her that I would not let anything happen to her. Just then, Mrs. Rosario stormed out of the house, demanding to know what was going on. She looked at the both of us, suspicious. What the hell is going on between the two of you? I stared into Estella's eyes with love in his. We never should have turned Roxie into that hologram, Mom. I turned to Mrs. Rosario. She's been having nightmares about it. She called and told me. I'm not going back to Roxie's house, Mom, Estella said, wiping away tears. Mrs. Rosario gave me a nasty glare. And you don't have to, baby. Estella shook her head. I'm coming to the house to get the rest of my things, and I'm going home. To my house. And you need to get out of Roxie's house your damn self, Mrs. Rosario said, so nasty I thought she was going to spit on me. That house belongs to her husband now, you know that. And I gave Mrs. Rosario a nasty, face-spitting look right back at her. Mrs. Rosario, that was uncalled for. I know whose house it is. Mrs. Rosario said, Doug's house. They were still married when my daughter passed away. Mrs. Rosario started pissing me off. And I said I know whose house it is and I did not intend to stay there. I'll be building my own mansion soon anyway. Good, you do that, Mrs. Rosario said. I said, Roxie's house needs to be turned into a museum anyway. Doug knows this. It'll make more money for Roxie's estate, like Graceland and Paisley Park. You are unbelievable, Mrs. Rosario said. I gave Mrs. Rosario a look of warning. Excuse me, Mrs. Rosario? Mrs. Rosario got in my face, invading my space with the strong scent of vodka and cranberry. How greedy can you be? My daughter's house is not a goddamn museum, it's someone's home. Don't you have enough money? My smart mouth got away from me. No. I don't. Mrs. Rosario shook her head in disgust, glaring at me like she wanted to break her glass against my head and use the shards to slit my throat. As Estella started crying, I held her in my arms and tried to comfort her, but I could see the disappointment in Mrs. Rosario's eyes. I knew that I had to leave, but it broke my heart to leave Estella in such a state. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of defeat, knowing that my greed for money and success had caused so much pain and suffering for those I loved.